And up next, we have a panel discussion looking at the UN SDGs, looking at their uptake by financial institutions, and how that might be changing or not as a result of COVID and changing economic conditions. So Dustin, who is the CEO of the Responsible Investment Association Canada, welcome. Are you there?
Yes, good morning, Ben.
A super timely, important, exciting session. So looking forward to hearing about it. I'm going to hand over to you. Thank you for taking the time to do this.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you to Climate Action and UNEP FI for convening these important dialogues. And thank you to Elliot for sharing some helpful insights to get us started and which provide a great foundation for our panel discussion here this morning. We've got a great panel lined up. We're talking about the Sustainable Development Goals and the adoption of the SDGs, particularly among the investment community. Finance alone will not save the world, but finance moves money, and what gets money gets done. And I believe this certainly applies to sustainable development. We're going to start with a discussion of the landscape. What's the state of play, and what does it mean for an investor to be aligned with the SDGs? And then we're going to explore whether extractive industries can be aligned with the SDGs. We'll get into some discussion of measuring impact and alignment, and then a little bit of reflection upon the pandemic, how that's impacting the investor alignment with the SDGs and the road ahead. So first, to start things off, I'm going to call each speaker to the stage, to the virtual stage, to speak for a couple of minutes about themselves and their roles. We're going to start with Olga Emelianova, who's the Executive Director at MSCI ESG Research, who leads their work on sustainable investing research. Olga, if you could just give us a bit of an overview of your work, that would be great.
Sure. Thank you, Dustin, and thank you, Climate Action, for inviting me to this interesting discussion. So, as Dustin mentioned, I'm an executive director at MSCI ESG Research, and I'm leading our work on developing new solutions, but also supporting existing ones in enabling investment community to make informed decisions around impact investing, sustainable finance, navigate the world around the evolving regulatory trends, as we heard earlier, some of the nuances around definitions and sometimes conflicting definitions of what sustainable activity may or may not be. And to that end, building on the recent uptick in the financial market participant interest in sustainable finance and impact investing, we've been focusing on developing quite a few interesting solutions around, of course, climate mitigation, climate risk management, but also around sustainable development goals and creating some of the framework that enable investors to identify companies and investment solutions and instruments that could be aligned with the goals. So I'm happy to talk about that later during the panel.
Thank you, Olga. I'd like to call to the virtual stage Terry Heyman, who's the Chief Financial Officer with the World Gold Council. Terry, if you could give us an introduction, please.
Of course. Thank you, Dustin, and thank you, Climate Action, for hosting this conversation. So the World Gold Council is a membership organization. We represent the world's leading gold mining companies, 28 companies operating all over the world. And our role really is to speak about the role that gold plays in today's world. What role does gold have? What is the purpose? Why do investors still value holding gold in their portfolios and continue to make choices to invest in gold? And one of those choices that is being increasingly considered as part of the consideration set is how is the metal produced, how are risks associated in the mining phase managed, and importantly, what is the contribution that the gold sector can play in contributing to sustainability at large and the UN's SDGs specifically. So we at the World Gold Council work collectively with our membership to help share experiences and indeed set best practice as to what constitutes responsible gold mining. Last year, we put out the Responsible Gold Mining Principles, the culmination of a 2-year project, working with a very broad range of stakeholders to set out an overarching framework for the material E, S, and G risks in this sector. Off the back of that, if you can operate responsibly, it's very clear that gold mining companies can really significantly support sustained social and economic development in line with the SDGs, and we've just put out some new work on that. And all of this speaks to what is gold's role in modern society.
Thank you, Thierry. Looking forward to those discussions. Next, I'd like to call Bertrand Valkenaer to the virtual stage. He's the Deputy Chief Executive Officer of AFD. Bertrand, if you could give us an introduction, please.
Thank you very much, Dustin, and thank you, Climate Action, for hosting this event. So I am the Deputy CEO of a public development bank, which is 100% owned by the French state. And as a public development bank, we provide financing to 85 countries, and we also provide technical expertise, working on two legs. One leg is the public policy dialogue that we have with the states where we intervene, and the second leg relates to the project that we finance in those 85 countries. Our mandate as a public bank is driven by two main factors. The first one is Africa and African activities. We deploy every year 50% of our commitments, of our annual commitments in Africa, and those commitments amounted to a total of 14 billion in 2019. So it means that approximately 7 billion were invested by us in Africa last year. And we're also driven by the fight against climate change, because 50% of our activity has to be directed towards projects that will contribute to the fight against climate change. And that means that in some countries will be lower than 50, and others, for instance, in Latin America or Asia, will go up to 70% of our activity dedicated to climate. We are part of a wider network of 26 public development banks called International Development Finance Club, which represented 3 trillion of accumulated assets in 2019. And we work with them together on financing development projects worldwide. Thank you.
Thank you, Bertrand. I'd like to call Rosa Vanden Beemt to the virtual stage. Rosa is the Vice President of Responsible Investing with BMO Global Asset Management, which is a Canadian financial institution. Rosa, please take it away.
Thank you, Dustin, and thank you, Climate Action. It's a pleasure to be here today, and apologies for not being able to join you via video. And in true working from home fashion, my computer gave out this morning. So a little bit about BMO Global Asset Management. We are a global asset management firm with offices around the world, with around 250 billion in assets under management, and we are the asset management arm of the Bank of Montreal. We have a long history of responsible investing, with the first ethical fund that we launched in 1984 in the UK. And at present day, we have ESG integrated across all of our funds, as well as a range of funds that are specifically geared towards responsible and sustainable investments. One of these funds is our SDG engagement fund, that has both investment opportunities that are picked according to the opportunity to contribute to the SDGs, as well as work that our team does through engagement with companies in the fund to ensure that they enhance their contribution to the SDGs and also report better accordingly. And so the team that I work in is the responsible investment team. We're about 20 professionals, and the majority of us focus on our engagement with the companies that we own on ESG issues. So that can be direct dialogue with boards or management, as well as proxy voting. My own responsibility within that team is engagement in North America and also wider engagement on the topic of human rights. I also sit on the steering committee for the Investor Alliance of Human Rights. And then lastly, we have an engagement service that we offer to external clients where we engage companies on their behalf for those organizations that might not have the capacity in-house. And the SDGs also play an important role to our clients, so I'm happy to elaborate on that later.
Thank you, Rosa. So I think we have a great group with different segments of the market represented, which should produce a great dynamic discussion. So let's dive right in. I think it would be helpful to start with a little bit of discussion about the current state of play for investor adoption of the SDGs. What are the key trends and key issues that we're seeing in the market? And for that, I'd like to start with you, Olga, given your role in a global ESG data provider firm. You want to kick us off with some thoughts on the current state of play?
Sure. Well, I think, as I mentioned earlier, we definitely see quite an uptick in financial market participant interest in the impact. It's certainly becoming not a niche investment strategy anymore, and more companies and individual investors are interested in considering impact in their investment strategies. In fact, there was quite an interesting study, I believe it was published just about a year ago by Morgan Stanley Institute for Sustainable Investing. And what it found that about 95% of millennial investors are interested in impact investing. And of course, that might not be a shocker. We all know that younger generations are quite concerned about the state of the environment, about sustainability. But what is very interesting from that study is that 85% of all individual investors are expressing interest in impact investing. So that certainly sets the tone in the global market, especially within the wealth management and the individual investment space. But even among the institutional investors, the trend is picking up. Whether it's a specific thematic approach, pension funds been quite active in this space. Been working with the GPIF for many years now around the issues of the diversity, but then also in a broader sense around the SDG alignment and around the sustainable impact. We see this rapid evolution of new frameworks and new approaches how to integrate it in the investment strategies. You might have heard news just a few weeks ago that several largest Dutch pension funds, they announced this new sustainable investment framework. But what also I think defines the market in the recent months or within a year, I would say, is this rapid growth in the policymakers' interest around the impact and sustainability. And we've certainly seen a lot of developments recently in that space. So if it's not explicitly tied to specific SDG goals, but the European Sustainable Finance Initiatives and regulations, they're built on the objectives of Paris Agreement and United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. They're trying to figure out what sustainable impact is, what sustainable activities are based on, defining this taxonomy, and also developing some of the metrics for reporting around impact and measuring impact. So based on all of those trends, I think that there's been a blast of new approaches, new definitions, new frameworks on assessing impact, on assessing sustainable development goals, and alignment within the investment portfolios, but also within the corporate strategies.
Thank you, Olga. I think that's a helpful start. I'm going to stay with you, and then we'll go to Bertrand. I think that the next question, logically, is what does it mean to be aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals? Olga, you want to start that off, and then we'll hear from Bertrand.
Well, it's a great question, Dustin, but I'm afraid that this is also the question that does not have a correct answer because, there's so many different viewpoints and different approaches how to measure SDGs, what alignment means. And within MSCI, we started exploring this idea and this question just a few years ago. I think it was in 2018 when we collaborated with OECD to kind of explore the idea and maybe develop a proof of concept around what we call then SDG net alignment. And the result of that collaboration was the paper that we published, and it's public, I think it was in early 2019, around the potential framework of measuring sustainable development net alignment. And I'm happy to say that it did result in the actual solution and the toolkit that we released earlier this year. And what we attempted to do is basically to address three core challenges. The first one is whether or not we can measure impact holistically, accounting for both the positives and the negatives, possible adverse impact of the company's operations, and as well as products and solutions that they offer. The second objective was to see whether or not we can eliminate the disclosure bias. And then the third, and very important for the investment community, is to be able to provide comparable signal for as many companies as possible, so for larger investment universe. So building on those objectives, the first one around holistic approach, what we meant by that is looking into the companies not through the lens of just the positive contributions, but understanding that companies are never perfect, that there are some areas where they're positively contributing towards development of some of the solutions, but also some areas that their operations or the products that they're releasing to the market might have some adverse impact. So that concept evolved as a net effect of the company's operations and product portfolios in addressing different goals. And then the other two challenges, they're sort of interrelated in a way of kind of eliminating the bias, but also expanding the coverage universe. You see the current kind of frameworks and approaches to the SDG and impact measurements, they push quite a lot of burden on the monitoring, measuring, reporting of impact on the corporate issues. And, in addition to other existing reporting frameworks, so that in its turn leads to two problems. Only a handful of companies are able to assess and report on their impact using those prescribed frameworks and measurements. And then the second challenge is that when you use an SDG model that relies exclusively on corporate disclosure, then you might face the risk of either real or perceived subjectivity of such results. So what we propose to do, and what became kind of the foundation of the approach that we call SDG alignment, is to look at the existing data, right? We already collect a lot of the data on the companies around their environmental, social governance policies, practices, and performance. There is quite a lot of the information that we can already leverage. It might not be perfect. It might not be very precise in terms of the number of patients cured or, girls sent to school, but maybe we don't have time to wait for this perfect reporting and for those exact measurements. We do need to produce some signal now. So we take any data that we have, and then we supplement this data from just the corporate sources with some additional, what you call third-party sources, be it media, maybe NGO report, some of the controversial actions or involvement, to provide that holistic view on the company's performance and eliminate that disclosure bias. So in the result, what SDG alignment means, according to this framework, is basically a scale or degree of alignment that we represent on the, kind of the 5 different assessment areas, from strongly aligned to aligned, neutral, misaligned, and strongly misaligned. Again, it's not exact measurement of the impact. It's more directional approach, kind of indicating which companies are tilting one way or the other. But we think that this is a very important framework and an important tool to start applying it on the larger set of companies. And the tool is now available for about 8,600 companies, global companies, that provides certainly a very useful tool for the investors to be able to evaluate their options and the choices when they make that decision to allocate capital.
Thank you, Olga. That's helpful. It sounds like, in public markets, defining what is aligned with the SDGs is still a work in progress, but there's lots of activity happening on that front, and it's not necessarily a binary aligned or not aligned. There is a spectrum. And I'd like to now pivot to Bertrand, where you sit within a development finance institution. I'm curious to hear your perspective on what does it mean for a project to be aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals.
Thank you very much, Dustin. I would like to begin with 2 concrete examples of what we do in the field, try to help our auditors to understand better what we mean by being aligned. The first one is a project that we run in Ivory Coast, where we financed a program to provide access to sustainable electricity. And that program actually had 3 major components. The first one was the construction of a pilot floating solar power plant. The second one was the reduction and the substitution of kerosene lamps by an efficient lighting solution in rural areas. And the third component was the development of a smart grid development program to reduce the loss of energy that was coming from a gas power plant. So what I want to show with that example is that we had 3 components instead of looking at one component, and we worked on a comprehensive solution that was trying to address at the same time different aspects of bringing renewable energy in Ivory Coast. The second example I would like to give is an example in adaptation, and it was made in partnership with the local authorities of the Gaza Strip. We built a facility to use wastewater that was treated to recharge and depollute a coastal aquifer. And the good thing in the project that we built was that we were then able, at the same time, to treat the water, to replenish a local ground aquifer, and we also were able to make sure that the system we had put in place would provide both water for the local population and water for irrigation and local agriculture. So what I want to show with those two examples is that we looked at them, trying to have them aligned with the SDGs, and we tried to incorporate as many of those 17 components into those two projects. And instead of looking at one very specific aspect, either the coastal aquifer or the treatment or the agriculture or the need of water by the local people, we incorporated all those aspects in one single project. It was built over time with the local authorities, strong partnership and strong ownership that was needed. And we brought at the same time technical expertise to make sure that obviously the water that was re-injected into the coastal aquifer was safe enough for the ground, for the population, and for the crops that would grow in the future. And this is exactly the type of mandate that public institutions have to implement, because we are owned by states or owned by several states in the case of multilateral finance institutions such as the World Bank. And those states give us the mandate to implement in the field what they have negotiated either in the G20 forum or in the United Nations forum or in any kind of forum that is implementing measures that in the field against climate change and so on. And we do it because as public institutions, we can have sometimes a longer term view than private institutions. We can also, to some extent, take more risks than private and the local actors. And we also have technical expertise inside our processes that enables us to have both a dialogue with the authorities and see how they can transform their regulation to incorporate the SDGs within those regulations. And we also have the financing tools, warranty, equity, loans, debt, and the technical expertise, education, transports, energy, that will enable us to develop in the field projects that match the structural reform that are put in place by those institutions. So to put it simply, public development banks can help push serious money into adaptation, recovery, and resilience, and therefore try to adapt an economy, projects, laws with the 17 SDGs. Thank you.
Thank you, Bertrand. That was a great overview. I'd like to remind the audience that you can ask questions, and we will be addressing them a little bit later on, so please feel free to type them in. I'd like to pivot over to the asset manager's perspective. Rosa, what are you seeing in the market with respect to the Sustainable Development Goals? How is your firm approaching the SDGs?
Thank you, Dustin. I think that we are seeing in the market, mostly by institutional investors, that the SDGs have been more popular as a framework for engagement and a framework for impact investing among European institutional investors. But it has gained some popularity in North America. But I think, Europe is a region that's typically a little bit more advanced when it comes to sustainable finance anyways. What I think is interesting from our perspective, and something that we didn't necessarily anticipate, is that the SDG fund that I referenced earlier is particularly popular with retail investors, and actually has become our most popular fund in Europe in the past 2 years or so. And I think this really shines a light on what individual investors are interested in when they are trying to create, a change through their investments. it might be their their savings that they're investing. But if they care about investing with purpose, so to speak, the SDGs offer just a really easy framework that resonates with people, and that sort of creates a common language with people, and that also creates some nice stories, I think, for people to relate to. So that said, we look at the SDGs internally in three ways, both as investment opportunities, and then secondly, creating change through engaging on the SDGs with the companies that we invest in, and thirdly, looking at impact and reporting on impact. So when we start with looking at investment opportunities, I mentioned the SDG fund that we have. It really looks at small to mid-cap global companies that are picked according to whether or not they can make a positive impact towards the SDGs. They need to be high quality companies already, and they need to have some type of revenue stream that is related to underlying SDG targets. And I'll explain a little bit more about that later. And then secondly, the engagement overlay that we have. So really engaging the companies both in that fund, but also across our entire fund lineup on how they are performing against the SDG targets, wherever it's relevant for those companies and their businesses. And I think we view the SDGs as really an ideal roadmap, both for investors and companies, which creates, common language among stakeholders. And when we started doing this internally, trying to, map the SDGs onto, or SDG targets onto company revenue streams, there wasn't a lot of data out there yet. So we had to create a framework internally. We identified that out of the 169 targets that the SDGs set in total, there are about 80 that we think are relevant to investors in particular. And then, as I mentioned, we mapped revenue sources for each company to the SDGs using those 80 targets. I think we recognize that type of mapping doesn't capture all information. For example, it doesn't look at the way that companies treat their employees and other stakeholders. But wherever we have such gaps in the data, we try to fill this in through our engagement with the companies. And particularly for the SDG fund, the engagement with companies in the fund is about 100%, or at least over 95% of companies are engaged each year. And I think when we, revenue alignment and positive impact, but we also recognize that companies can have a negative impact on the SDGs as well. So we have been started to capture this through our own internal methodologies as well, and also have started reporting on this in our impact reporting. And I'll leave it at that for now.
Thanks, Rosa. I'd like to stay with you for a moment. We have a few questions coming in, and many of them are specific to Canada and the Canadian market. And it actually is a nice segue into the next part of our discussion on extractives. Rosa, one of the questions is from Carrie Max, who's a special advisor, climate finance, with Global Affairs Canada. Carrie is asking, given Canada's particular exposure to climate transition risk and the energy sector, how are you dealing with significant exposure to high carbon industry or other sectors that could arguably be misaligned with the SDGs? You talked a little bit about engagement already, but perhaps if you could address that directly, that would be helpful.
Yes, of course. And I think it's a really great question. And particularly as, a Canadian-based company, I think this is, something that we are very much aware of, just the fact that the Canadian economy is so much based on natural resource extraction. And so the way that we view this issue is really that we aim to stay invested in companies that are not, the greatest laggards on this topic, and companies that are open to engaging with investors on working towards solutions for a low carbon economy. So, globally, we, for example, as a lot of institutional investors, are part of the Climate Action 100 Plus Investor Alliance, which engages companies across the world, including in Canada. We are co-lead for a Canadian company, engaging that company on how it can really diversify its business and also create a strategy, a long-term strategy, in order to be aligned with a low-carbon future. So I think we believe that engagement is really critical to this, as long as we can have, so to say, a seat at the table, and companies are progressing meaningfully. We think it is worthwhile to continue to collaborate on this topic. Unfortunately, we will be needing, oil and gas for a little bit more, and so the better we can work on such a transition. And then I think, secondly, I would add that we do, target specifically through our engagement companies that are really lagging on this topic, and that are the largest polluters. And so we have several strategies in place. We've been voting, for example, in the last year against certain directors on boards where companies have not been meeting our expectations when it comes to climate change reporting and climate change performance.
Thank you, Rosa. That's helpful. It sounds like stewardship is an important piece of this transition towards a more sustainable economy from the investors' perspectives. I'd like to stay with the topic of extractive industries, and I'd like to hear from you, Terry, on how the mining industry is responding to the SDGs. If you could share perspective on that, that'd be helpful.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. Look, I think it builds on well from that previous conversation and what we've heard from the other panelists. I mean, even this idea that Olga raised, which I very much agree with, of what is the net impact and how do you think about net impact? And extractives undoubtedly have an impact in terms of their environmental impact. They are by nature extractive. It's really important, it's critical that mining companies operate responsibly and that they appropriately mitigate their impacts. Because if they are able to do that and they are able to operate responsibly, the potential for them to drive sustained socio and economic development is really significant. And let me give you some examples. If you look at the gold sector in particular, gold mines tend to be found in more remote locations. Gold is scarce. It is obviously a resource that you can't choose where you find gold. It is where it is. And gold is very dispersed across the world. And increasingly, if you look at a map of where gold is mined today, it is mined generally in more remote locations where the communities often do not have the services and quality of life that perhaps more urban places do and other parts of the world do that have a more diversified economy. And so it becomes a part of the role that gold mining companies play to support the social and economic development in those communities and indeed countries where they operate. And I'm talking about the provision of healthcare facilities done to make sure that the workforce remain healthy and are looked after, and health and safety has been at the forefront of the mining sector's efforts for a long time. It's well understood in the mining community that if you're able to operate safely, it means that in general you're able to operate well. But thinking actually more broadly around managing community health, recognizing that community health is important to a vibrant community, which in turn supports an effective mining operation. If you think about education, very similar perspective in terms of the need to support the community in order to provide a workforce that is well equipped to work at mines and indeed to support the livelihood and effectiveness of the overall community. really important for mining companies that they help support the general economic development. Everybody recognizes mines have finite lives. At some point, the resource will run out, and it's incumbent on mining companies to play their role in helping to spur economic activity in the surrounding community through local sourcing, through training and development, and indeed through infrastructure development, through when they develop power plants or they build roads to allow them to be able to operate, that they do that in a way that supports the communities. And of course, we haven't even touched on taxes and royalty payments and the material financial contribution that mining companies can make. Again, very often in places that don't have a lot of other economic activities. So I think that there is a very significant amount that the gold mining community, that responsible operators in the gold mining community contribute towards the Sustainable Development Goals. We at the World Gold Council have just put out a report profiling what our members do, 28 of the world's leading gold mining companies, and it really is across the globe and across almost all of the 17 SDGs. I agree with the earlier points. It's sometimes difficult to pull out one in isolation. You often see activities work across the spectrum. But again, it all needs to be underpinned by this foundation around operating responsibly, having clarity as to what that means, having an organizing framework that allows these companies to discuss with their investors, to engage. And I think Rosa's points are very well made. There needs to be and should be engagement to allow the investors to understand how corporates make those trade-offs. So that's where I see the gold sector, the gold mining sector in particular. One final thought is just I think it's really important also to consider the supply chain at large. And the World Gold Council have done a lot of work in terms of making sure that investors and consumers can have confidence in the gold, where it comes from, how it's been produced, making sure that they know that there are responsible practices behind it. But when we're talking about the SDGs, also important to think about the role gold itself plays in addressing the SDGs and helping us meet the 2030 target, and in areas around financial inclusion in terms of resilience. And we've seen that this year in particular. Gold plays a really important role. Gold's role as a store of value is well understood. And for many, many individuals, households, communities around the world, gold is a primary means of protecting financial security. Gold also plays important roles in healthcare applications, including in rapid diagnostic testing kits, and millions of those are distributed each year to test for diseases such as malaria and TB. And I know that progress is underway at the moment looking at COVID-19, and that will potentially be a gold-based diagnostic testing kit. And indeed in green tech. And as we think about the transition to a low carbon economy, gold and other metals are going to play a role as well. So there is a need to look at the bigger picture, to think about this in the broad, to understand the really critical role that responsible business plays, but always based in this recognition that when you do have impact, that is appropriately managed and mitigated.
Thank you, Terry. That's a helpful start there. I'd like to now keep on this topic of extractives. And then I'd like to, I actually spoke with Terry earlier this week, and he said he doesn't mind sitting in the hot seat. So I'd like to go to the other panelists and hear from you. Do you think that extractive companies can be credibly aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals? Perhaps, Olga, if you want to lead us off, and then we'll hear from Rosa and Bertrand.
Sure. Yes, knowing that Terry is going to be on the panel, I did do a little bit of homework and tried to zoom into the metals and mining industry and review some of the results that our model provides on assessing the industry contribution to addressing the SDG goals. So we looked at 272 global mining companies. So it's a pretty large set. And what we found, and just as a reminder, again, the framework looks into the degree of the alignment from the extremes, from, strongly aligned to strongly misaligned. And on those extremities, we found that only 2 companies out of 272 were strongly aligned on one or more SDGs. And both of those companies were not traditional extractives. They were primarily involved in urban mining, what is called recycling of metals. And of the same set of companies, about 5% were found to be strongly misaligned, and mostly due to the involvement in very severe adverse impact controversy, some of those massive, incidents that affected a lot of people and large areas of land. So that certainly looks pretty scary on the extremities, but I think that there is also some pretty positive finding that I can share is that looking at the broader picture, as Terry mentioned, we need to be looking into the broader sense and kind of looking into the aggregate, which side this alignment is tilting more for the industry, how many issues are generally more aligned versus the misaligned. We do find that the tilt is going towards showing some positive momentum. So there's still quite a lot of companies, in fact, 17% in the sample set, that were mostly involved in some of the activities that showed misalignment. There was more than a quarter, actually 27.5% of companies within the industry set that were generally more aligned with the goals, and basically showing some of the incentives or some new initiatives and showing progress in improving performance that has much more positive impact on the environment and the community. One interesting area that we found that to be a clear outliers in terms of which of the SDGs impact of the interest seems to be addressed across the board, and that turns out to be the SDG 10, which is the reducing inequalities globally. And primarily it's driven by programs that support economic development of the communities. So a lot of the philanthropic activities, a lot of investment into the local economic development, inclusive employment, including some of the local populations, and measurement and reduction of impact, including environmental impact on the communities. So that's kind of a larger picture. So obviously there is enough space for specific engagement and kind of addressing some of those extremities that I pointed out. But I think there is a lot of also happening within the industry that shows this trajectory in finding the solutions and minimizing that adverse impact.
Thank you, Olga. And forgive me, Rosa and Bertrand, we're running a little short on time, so I'd like to make sure we leave time to talk about data and benchmarking and the pandemic. So I'd like to give Terry an opportunity to respond to what Olga had just said.
Thank you. And thank you, Olga. And I think it's really interesting research, and it's great that we are getting this kind of data. I think it's important that, as we've talked about before, standardization and understanding what exactly is being looked at. But I absolutely agree. Where mining companies operate responsibly, there is the potential for very significant sustained social and economic impact. And so to this point of there is real potential for the mining sector, absolutely. Engagement is necessary to encourage all mining companies to operate to the same high levels that I know our members, the world's leading gold mining companies, are committed to. And I think the investor community has a really strong role to play in saying, just as Rosa was putting out before, look, this is what we expect. This is the level of responsible performance that we expect you to behave to achieve. And there are consequences in terms of capital not being allocated that way if you're not able to demonstrate how you are a responsible mining company. And then I think the potential is significant, but it is incumbent on mining companies to also communicate what they do. And I'm sure Olga has seen this through the work that she's led. It's not always that easy to understand what mining companies are doing because historically it hasn't always been the sector that has most effectively communicated progress on these types of issues. And I think that's changing. I think that's really positive. And I think our report speaks to that. And I hope it will spur more mining companies to clearly set out how they are contributing against the SDGs, which, as we've discussed, are a great organizing framework that everybody can align on and just provides for really meaningful conversations.
Thank you, Terry. And I think that sets us up well for the next part of the discussion related to data measurement and benchmarking. I'd like to go to Olga, and then we'll hear from Rosa and Bertrand. Olga, if we could, within 60 minutes or less, how are companies reporting against the SDGs? What are you seeing on this front?
Well, I think it's certainly a challenge for the corporate community, given that the SDGs were designed for the countries to find the right measurements. So there've been quite a few new tools evolving. The SDG Compass is probably one of the most commonly referred to. There's some new interesting developments around the accountant associations. I believe last year there was some toolkit released that kind of takes into consideration other existing frameworks for the disclosure. But the bottom line, I think that it's still we don't have standardized approach. We don't have specific metrics and reporting requirements, and it's still kind of a free form reporting for a lot of companies, which has its pluses and minuses. And I think the biggest minus is that when we don't have a good reference, then there is this possibility either for greenwashing, what is called, or impact washing, if you wish, where companies are kind of choosing from the basket of different metrics what to report on. But there's also a big risk for some companies to underreport their impact. And in fact, we've done some study earlier this year in March, and we looked at the large companies reporting on the SDGs, or kind of self-reporting or announcement of their commitment to specific SDGs, and then compared it to some of the data that we have in terms of companies' product mix, positive contribution to the SDGs, as well as maybe involvement in some of the controversial activities. And what we did find is that there's about 10% of the global companies, and it's like 3,000 plus large corporations, that do make public commitment to specific SDG, but they're also involved in some of the controversial activities or events that might suggest the opposite. So, for example, committing to the diversity and employment of the minorities, but then also being implicated in some of the controversies and lawsuits around discrimination. So 10% is a large number, but what I found also interesting from that study is that 28%, so nearly 1/3 of the companies underreport their impact. So those are the companies that did not make any public statement or commitment to the SDGs, but we find them to be aligned through the products that they're putting in the market, through developing some solutions, or through some of the actions on how they run their business. So I think that this is also a big risk, because it basically puts those companies, remove them from the investor radar and from the interest of this particular type of investment strategies.
Thank you, Olga. And we've got, I believe, roughly 10 minutes or just over 10 minutes left. So I'd like to ask our panelists to try to keep responses to 60 seconds or less. I'd like to now hear from the investors, Rosa and then Bertrand. What frameworks or benchmarks are you using as investors to measure companies' performance and impacts on the SDGs? Rosa, let's start with you.
Thanks, Dustin. Yeah, as I mentioned previously, we have an internal methodology, and so we've defined about 16 impact metrics. They are different from regular ESG performance indicators, mainly because we've built them to track the outcomes that a company's operations or products or services has for the environment or for the lives of stakeholders. But I think the challenge that we've come across is that in practice, many companies, when they report out, mainly focus on their actions as a proxy for impact. For example, we've launched 5,000 new microloans this year, rather than actually diving deeper and using those metrics to demonstrate that they've had a positive effect. So, for example, these new microloans have improved borrowers' income by X%. So ideally, impact metrics should address the multiple dimensions of impact, like the impact management project has defined. So we would like companies to consider what type of impact they have, how much, who is affected, the contributions their actions have had beyond what would have happened anyway, and where they are forecasting future impact. And I think to just address the greenwashing element of this, we are really trying to be conscious of having that the impact that we're having is having, actual on the ground making improvements. And so we've partnered with a ethical trade consultancy specializing in improving labor conditions within supply chain through local action in factories. And so we are currently talking with companies in our SDG funds to partner with that consultancy to be able to drive quicker change with more impact on the ground.
Thank you, Rosa. And I've been informed we have now 12 minutes left, so a little bit of an extension, which is great. Bertrand, I'd like to hear from you on what frameworks or benchmarks you're using to measure SDG performance.
Thank you, Dustin. We have two kinds of tools. One is an internal tool that we use to screen our projects and that we developed over the last 5 years since the adoption in September 2015 of the SDGs. So it's basically is a set of principles and criteria that we compare to the projects and the components of the projects that we analyze. It's a bit complex. We have both qualitative and quantitative information, and it makes us confident to some extent, because we still do not have found the perfect tool, but it makes us confident to some extent that our projects are Paris Agreement aligned or SDG aligned. And we do it in conjunction with other public finance institutions, with multilateral institutions, for instance, or bilateral institutions such as the German KfW institution or the European Investment Bank. And what is important is to remind what Elliot Harris was saying in its introduction, that we are all looking at what being SDG aligned means as of today, and one day we will probably, under the push of the market or civil society or other factors, have to converge and go towards a single model which would be widespread. And the second tool we use is a macroeconomic model that we have developed and which we use to discuss with countries on what their trajectory as far as climate change is concerned will look like in 5, 10, or 15 years. And as an example, we've run a study with the CPI think tank looking at transition risks in South Africa and what low carbon in the future means for a country that heavily relies on coal production and coal exportations as of today, and that also heavily relies on coal power plant to produce its electricity. So it's interesting because it gives you basis for discussions on what their economy will look like in the future and how South Africa could begin by looking at its mining companies and all the people that are employed by mining companies and think about what they will do in the future if coal prices drop to a level where it will not be sustainable to continue to work with those mines. And a last word on the EU taxonomy for financial investors. We also look at those criteria, as it was mentioned earlier, because it's important for us to also have a set of criteria which we can use to refinance our operations in the market with investors who are interested in looking at what we do and who look for sustainable projects to finance. Thank you.
Thank you, Bertrand. I'd like to stay with you. How is the pandemic, and some audience members were asking about this too, and I wanted to make sure we discussed the impact of the pandemic on responsible and impact investing and SDG investing. Bertrand, could you share your perspective on how the pandemic has impacted this market?
As a public institution, what we've seen, and we've also been mobilized to in some way assuage the economic cost of the pandemic for developing countries, what we've seen is countries stepping in heavily at the very beginning and very early in the pandemic, at the very beginning to assuage the impact of the economic crisis that relates to the pandemic. It was much faster than in 2008. probably because of a lessons learned effect. And it was also driven by the fact this was not a financial crisis, it was a crisis linked to an external factor, and there was still confidence in the financial system, which was not the case in 2008. So countries, international institutions stepped in heavily to support their health systems. Multilateral institutions provided emergency loans to developing and emerging economies who asked for them. And we've also seen the G20 calling for a suspension of the sovereign debt repayments in principal and interest for lower income countries who are facing treasury difficulties. So that was the first part of the response, and which were deployed in April, May, June, July, and we still have countries who are facing difficulties and who need to rely on those financing to support their economy. Now, what we see in developed and advanced economies is the recovery plans that have been put in place. And this is where we have very fierce and strong debates on what kind of components of sustainability those recovery plans should incorporate. There was an interesting survey made by Vivid Economics. It's a strategy consultancy firm released this summer in the review Nature. And they analyzed 16 of the G20 recovery plans and found that 16 of them, or the vast majority of them, 2/3 of them actually, had a negative impact on the environment. So that illustrates the current tension we have between short-term results, saving jobs, employments, and thinking about the future and how the investments that we are making today, knowing that those investments are made with money which will not be available in the future, and at a time where countries are getting heavily indebted, we have a clear tension as of today between responsible and impact investing and the decisions that the state should make on a longer term perspective, and the emergency situation that companies, people, jobs, health sectors are facing as of today. So it's a very complex situation, and it requires a very strong political courage to be able to manage both at the same time short-term and longer-term impacts. Thanks.
Thank you, Bertrand. I think that's really helpful to hear that perspective on the macro. For the micro, I'd like to turn to Rosa and hear your perspective on how the pandemic is impacting the market from where you sit. Any perspective on that?
Yeah, thank you, Justin. I think, broadly challenges that we have encountered, specifically when it relates to, measuring impact on the SDGs, is, of course, certain countries suspending labor laws, making it very difficult for workers, and especially in a time when there is so much more stress on supply chains, international supply chains. This has been a big concern of ours. We've been doing some engagement work in certain countries to ensure that companies within those countries commit to still adhering to international standards, rather than the laws of the country that they operate in, if possible. Then, secondly, I think what we've seen is also the difficulty with auditors not being able to visit for example, factory sites in order to verify certain data. So because there is a difficulty with the auditor verification process, some of the data has become either delayed or less reliable. And then thirdly, with our engagement with companies, we're really trying to maintain focus on creating positive impact, but of course we understand that sometimes priorities are just different. If you need to be able to ensure that employees keep their jobs, for example, we were engaging a company on climate risk management recently, and they had promised us that they would set science-based emissions reduction targets. But because this was based on their ability to invest in new technologies, they had to prioritize keeping their existing factories and supply chain going. so that their investments in technologies would be delayed and the emission reduction targets would be delayed too. So we've seen various instances of this, and I think that's only fair, and we're just trying to keep working with companies for them to be able to prioritize what is most important. I think specifically, I think we would all agree that we would like them to prioritize their employees and stakeholders and health and safety at this time.
Thank you, Rosa. There's only a couple minutes left, so we won't be able to get through all of our moderated questions because we have some important questions coming in from the audience. One is on performance, and the question is, would the panelists agree that ESG is an important driver for long-term returns? Olga or Rosa, perhaps you have a perspective on this?
I can jump in.
Rosa.
Oh, please go ahead, Rosa.
Go ahead, Olga.
All right, great. So maybe, it's certainly an interesting question that comes up a lot, can we do both, right? Can we minimize the negative impact or maximize a positive impact and also, not jeopardize traditional risk and return structures or, the other factors. And maybe in this case, it would be good for me to kind of give a shout out to my colleagues at the MSCI Risk Center. They just published a study looking at ability to measure risk, carbon risk within the portfolios, assessing the risk within the portfolios, and also finding some of the solutions to fine-tune it to reduce the exposures while keeping some of the parameters, traditional parameters, the same, right? So it's a low tracking error, similar market exposures, and testing different strategies. I think they found they came to the conclusion that at least based on that exercise, it's absolutely possible. In fact, I think one of the scenarios that they looked at was able to reduce the carbon exposure by 75 or 74%.
Thank you, Olga. We're just about out of time. In fact, we are out of time, but I'd like to give the last question. I'd like to give the last question to Bertrand. The Sustainable Development Goals are part of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. 10 years is not a lot of time. So, Bertrand, do you think we will achieve the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030?
Thank you for that easy question, Dustin. I would think it's quite challenging for several reasons. The first one is that because of the pandemic, and we can see it every day in the papers or in the news, inequalities, poverty are on the rise. There's no debate about that. We've also seen that multilateralism, which is strongly needed to find solutions on such issues, is also threatened by the behavior of a few leaders who do not share the view that they should cooperate on a worldwide scale. And as I mentioned earlier, we have political agendas that are very much focused on short-term issues. But when we talk about this, and I also refer to what Ola said earlier today, we have very powerful drivers that I think will lead us in the right direction. Younger generations, interest of investors in sustainable finance and sustainable activities. We've also seen the mobilization of civil societies to an extent that we had never seen before, and they tend to have a longer view on what has to be done, and they have a very strong power, and they can bend what public policies and has to adjust them. And the good news, the good recent news dates back to last week when China pledged to be carbon neutral by 2060. This is not something that was widely commented, at least in the French press, and I regretted it very much because it will be very, very challenging for China. It is something that will also have impacts on what other countries do, because when I speak to companies, French companies or French investors, and when we talk about aligning by aligning the rules which they use to invest or work, they always say that Chinese investors or Chinese companies do not have to abide by the same rules and that they will have a competitive problem as regarding those companies. So if we now look at the different side by the fact that China is to be carbon neutral by 2060, we are now in the position to talk serious business with the Chinese authorities and see how they want to adapt their energy mix, how they will change their education system, how they will change their transportation system, and what will be their action plan in the 10, 20, 30 years to come to adjust it. Last but not least, we will have big meetings, international meetings in 2021, COP26, led by the UK on climate change, COP15, led by China on biodiversity, and France will host an event gathering 450 public development banks to see how we can shift public finance into as being more aligned with the SDGs and shifting the private financial flows towards the SDGs. So we have strong meetings that are going to take place, and I think the overall outlook is quite positive, because I'm positive on a personal basis, but also because the drivers that we see, I think, lead us in that way.
Thank you, Bertrand. I think the world could use some optimism right now. So I think that's a good way to end. I want to thank our panelists for a great discussion. I'd love to continue talking, but we are out of time. And with that, I believe I'm passing the floor over to Ben, I believe.
Thank you so much, Dustin, for a fantastic panel, really rich discussion, lots of really important topics covered, and good to end on a positive note as well. So thank you for chairing that so ably. Now, I'm not going to try and summarize all the things that were covered in that panel or in Elliot's remarks at the beginning of this session, but I think just a few things to highlight. One of the things is, and Elliot said this very ably, the role of central banks and financial supervisors in helping to ensure that capital goes in the right direction. Now, their work, the levers they can pull are not a sufficient condition, but they are a necessary one. And we need to think very carefully about how they can pull those levers and the levers that they have available to them. So that was a key point. The other thing that we discussed and the panelists discussed was around the SDGs and how the SDGs have actually been a way of spurring innovation. So most people, including myself to a degree, look at the SDGs and go, my God, so many of these targets, sub-targets, how are we going to be able to track progress towards the fulfillment of these things? It's far too complicated. But actually, people are responding to that complexity and coming up with ways to measure different outcomes, different positive outcomes associated with investments. And it's a combination of a science and an art, and there is still a lot of work to do to make sure that measurement is more consistent, more accurate, and represents what's actually happening on the ground, and the panelists talked a lot about that. But one key theme that came out was that seeking perfection shouldn't be the enemy of the good, and it's important that institutions trial these new measures of measuring impact. So a very, very rich conversation. That was just some of the things that I took away from that conversation. Now, we're going to continue the discussion next Thursday, so in a week's time, on the 8th of October. Please put the date and time in your calendar and join us live for part 3 of this 4-part series of the Sustainable Investment Forum North America 2020. I want to remind you that the event platform is available throughout the period, so it's available right up to mid-October. You can log in whenever you want. You can organize networking, schedule meetings with sponsors and exhibitors. You can watch all these sessions again and again, should you wish, or you can, if you've missed anything, you can go back and find it, and you can gain access to the virtual exposition as well. So looking forward to seeing you next week. Hope you have a fantastic week. See you on Thursday the 8th.